On behalf of the Historical Society of Harford County, I want to welcome you to this afternoon's presentation, The Washington Rochambeau Trail. I'm Jackie Seneschal, your host for Harvard Historical Society's Brown Bag Lunch Series. The Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route is a 680-mile series of roads used in 1781 by the Continental Army under the command of George Washington and the French forces under the command of Jean-Baptiste de Chastellux in their 14-week march from Newport, Rhode Island to Yorktown, Virginia, 4,000 French and 3,000 American soldiers. The French forces left Rhode Island in June of 1781, and they joined Washington's force on the Hudson River the following month. In August, the combined French and American armies headed south, marching through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, a route that allowed them to evade the British troops. They reached Williamsburg, Virginia in late 1781, several weeks after the French Royal Navy had won the Battle of the Chesapeake, preventing the British from reinforcing or evacuating General Cornwallis's army. On September 22nd, they combined with troops commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette. A 3-week siege of Yorktown led to Cornwallis's surrender on October the 19th, 1781. Throughout this, General Rochambeau was accompanied by Major General Francois Jean de Chastellux, a seasoned soldier with considerable training and expertise in reconnaissance. Chastellux developed a strong friendship with George Washington and served as a liaison between the two generals. If you listen closely today, you're going to hear new information that may be new even to the most seasoned historians of the American Revolution. Our guest today is Dr. Iris de Rode, a Dutch historian who specializes in the French participation in the American Revolution. She received her Ph.D. from the University of Paris 8, based on the personal papers of Major General Francois Jean de Chastellux. She teaches at Sciences Po in Paris and is in residence at the American Battlefield Trust. Welcome, Iris. Please tell us about the general and his role in the American Revolution.
Thank you so much for inviting me for this lunch lecture, let's call it like that. I'm very happy, of course, to be able to talk about the complicated to pronounce name Chastellux, Francois Jean de Chastellux in French, but there's a problem with the U at the end for English pronunciation, unfortunately. Could be one of the reasons he's a little forgotten today, because it's such a complicated name. And so what I'll do today is I will speak a bit about Francois Jean Chastellux, as that was the focus of my research, and that led me to really study this route that has been just described, that led to the to the independence of the United States. Of course, the route from Newport to Yorktown, but I will also add quite a lot of testimonies from other French, because I want to focus particularly on Harford County, which of course is one of the stops or the places they walked through in September of 1781, just before arriving in Yorktown. And so we'll look a little bit at Chastellux, but I will add about, I think, 10 other French officers that are describing that very particular moment, being September 9th and 10th, where they actually marched to Harford County. Because of course, for your historical society and the members and those that are listening, you might be wondering what exactly happened on that march and why it's relevant for the overall victory at Yorktown. So I will start sharing the screen, hopefully. Here we go. Share. Yes. Okay, here we go. And of course, here I can push on the button. So here we go. Now we can start. So I called this lecture the French March to Yorktown through Harford County. And so what I'll do, of course, is give you some background that has already been given, but I will go through a few of the key points that you have to understand if you have no clue what we're talking about when talking about the March to Yorktown. But then we'll go into a very detailed description of specifically these 2 days that I just said, September 9th and 10th. And so the reason I'm doing this is, of course, already said too, but I've earned a PhD on American history, and most specifically on Francois Jean de Chastellux, because I discovered his private archives in his family castle in Burgundy, based on a long story it's not the point of today, why I discovered all that. But what is interesting about that archive is that the papers of Francois Jean de Chastellux that had been thought lost were actually kept by his family for about 250 years. And some of the letters that they hold are relating to his American campaign, and more specifically, his correspondence with people such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Franklin, Adams. So those that we all know now as the founding fathers, but also with, of course, Rochambeau, his superior in command, the general of the French expeditionary forces that went to America, and with people such as Lafayette and other American officers as well, with whom he was working together. And so by looking at his correspondence and by looking at his writings about this time, we can learn quite some insights about the campaign of the French during the American Revolution. Another person I've been working on quite a lot too is called Mathieu Dumas. And Mathieu Dumas was an aide-de-camp of Rochambeau during the March to Yorktown. And he gives us much more information actually than Chastellux. Unfortunately, I've been really looking, but about Harford specifically, Chastellux has one sentence, while Dumas writes much more about that. Of course, I can tell you much more about Chastellux as for what he's done for the march, and especially how he prepared it, which I'll do during this lecture. But we'll also use Dumas, on which I published, it's a little book, it's nothing too crazy, but it's a translation of his sort of diary per day that he was writing while going on the march to Yorktown. And what Dumas was doing specifically was preparing the roads for those that would come after him. So what always happened when the actual army was marching, a few engineers were sent in front of them to prepare everything. And so that's Dumas' role, as we'll see. And he's describing Harford County quite a lot. And so before I start, I want to just, of course, show you a few images that might be familiar for you. This is, of course, a statue of Lafayette standing in Havre de Grace, Havre de Grace today, of course, in Maryland, which didn't really exist much at the time. It was completely different, as we'll see from the testimonies of the French officers. But Lafayette, of course, is celebrated as the most known French hero of the American Revolution. And so he's celebrated today also in Havre de Grace because he named the city the way it is named today, as it reminded him of Havre de Grace being the city today called Le Havre in France. So the location, the water, the way it's looking made him think of Havre de Grace, and so called it that way. He's of course also celebrated for his larger contribution to the American Revolution, and he was not part of the march, of course, to go to Yorktown, but he was in Yorktown already, around Yorktown, to keep Cornwallis and so the British troops, to keep them there and to make sure that when the French and American troops would arrive, they could actually attack him. So Lafayette played a crucial role in this campaign, and so of course he's celebrated all over as the Frenchman that participated. But there's many more Frenchmen that participated in this campaign, of course. So we can see too around in Harford County, you can see all these different marks and signs about someone called Rochambeau. So Rochambeau, most people do know him as being, of course, a French general that commanded what you called expeditionary army of about 6,000 men that was sent by the King Louis XVI to assist George Washington in his war against the British. The French, of course, sent their army mainly because they wanted to weaken the British Empire, and they thought the North American colonies would be a good way of, if they would be independent, the British Empire would suffer quite the blow. But they also, some of the French did actually believe in the cause of the American independence. But overall, you can say it's more just sort of geopolitical reasons that the French helped them. So we'll see more details after. But so around you, I guess somewhere around you, you will see these different signs indicating that the Count of Rochambeau's artillery camped here, or they camped here in another place, or an artillery baggage train. So all these different units apparently have camped around what's today called, of course, Harford County. So we'll dive into this to understand a little more and what it means. And I also want to mention, as you can see on these slides, 1782 out of a sudden appears. So the march we're just talking about is in 1781. But of course, after this march and after the victory of Yorktown, the French also returned. They went back up north to actually go to Boston and other places around to sail back to France. And so 1782 is another moment where the French actually passed Harford County on their way back. So that's all a little confusing if I would have to tell all the different sides. So I'm focusing on 1781 going to Yorktown, but be aware there was also an encampment about a year afterwards. But the most, of course, significant one is those that go to Yorktown, because if things would have gone terribly wrong along the road, maybe the Battle of Yorktown would never have happened, because the troops would not have arrived on time or would have been intercepted by the British, or other scenarios possible. So the route was, of course, very crucial. So to go back a little bit for the historical context, it's already been said, of course, but the French-American alliance starts in 1778. And so the whole period of the road to Yorktown is in 1781. The French-American cooperation started already before this, but that's not the subject today. It's really 1781. So the French arrived in 1780 in July in Newport, Rhode Island. And for about a year, they had to make sure to understand what they could actually do. And so what's decided between Rochambeau and Washington is that in August of 1781, they would, or it's more in July, but so in July, they would junction their armies in New York. And they were thinking we could maybe attack New York, because that's, of course, where the British had their stronghold. That's where they had their symbolic power and the largest part of their army stationed around Manhattan. So they wanted maybe to attack that, but they already knew that that was extremely hard because they were outnumbered by the British there. And so in August, the decision came that they would not go to New York, but that they would go further down south in order to attack Cornwallis in Virginia, where he had a smaller army which could be surrounded and attacked quite easily if the march went okay, and if all the different army units coming from Newport, from New York, from even the Caribbean islands, if they would all arrive at the same time, then victory could be possible. And so this operation of organizing the march over a very long road down south, down to Virginia, was crucial in winning independence. And so July 6th, as I said, junction happened in New York, and then from mid-August up until mid-September, they would march from New York down to Yorktown. And so in mid-September, they passed Harford. And of course, 1781, in September and October, the Battle of Yorktown happened, leading to the surrender of the British at Yorktown. And so of Cornwallis, the general, the British general, surrendering, as you can see on the painting too, which finally led, after a few years, to the independence of the United States. And so this is sort of symbolized, or today told, by this route that is still there today. So it's called the Washington Rochambeau National Historic Trail. And you can see here lots of different signs are around that route today, so you can recognize it, and maybe you live close by one of these places. But so it's President Barack Obama who signed in 2009 a law that designated this as a national historic trail, which of course is important as for its preservation, but also the goals that it will serve to tell the stories that it can tell. And so it's 680 miles and goes through 9 different states. And you can see here on the map that, of course, went from Newport to Yorktown, and you can see different arrows and different patterns on this map, because the columns were not all walking the exact same route. There were different routes taken. Most of the roads were not practicable for very large armies, so they had to divide the different army units in order to walk fast, but also in order to not put too much pressure on the lands around it or the encampment sites and so on. So that's important to remember, because what I'm going to say about Harford, they're not all walking in the same columns. It's otherwise it's totally impossible to understand how it all went, because they're walking different routes. Another thing is too that the French and American troops, of course, they were allies, but they did not walk together. The soldiers were kept separately from each other. One of the main reasons is that they had quite some differences between these different soldiers from different cultural, religious, linguistic backgrounds. And so it was considered that for their discipline, it was better to keep them apart because they might actually start to fight with each other, which was, of course, not the point of the allies. So they were always walking separately from each other. And so today this trail, which of course preserves and interprets the routes taken by the American and French between 1780 and 83, or 80, but because 1780 is also a period where it's kind of starting, which I'll explain after as well. But so it's all to commemorate the role of this the critical French-American alliance, because of course, without the French, the Battle of Yorktown would not have happened. And probably American independence would not have happened either, because of course the French soldiers, but also the French weapons and the French money that they provided. And so why is this all relevant? And why is what I'm gonna tell you relevant too, is that of course the successful French-American organization of the March to Yorktown, which went on land, but also on water, was crucial for success at Yorktown and thus American independence. As I already said, if all these different units did not arrive at the same time, Yorktown would not have happened. And so the logistical organization of this march is something to really consider if you think about why did the Americans win their independence. And so without organization, planning, realization, Yorktown would not have been possible. And so it's also interesting about this route is that it doesn't only tell this logistical feat, if you want, or the stories of George Washington and Rochambeau only. It tells a story of all those people that participated. It tells a story of the soldiers that walked, that came from various backgrounds in Europe. For instance, most of the French, or a large part of the French, were not necessarily French. They were also German, for instance, German hired soldiers. Some of of course, the Continental Army was also very diverse. And so it's not only white Americans, there are also Black Americans walking in this march, Native Americans, women, all various groups were participating in this march. And that's something that is sometimes forgotten or not really told. But by looking at this trail and the route, you can tell the story of all these different people. Also the people that were living around the route that were providing things to the army, such as food or fabric for tents and so on. So there's a large, you have to think of this as something that can tell the actual story of the American Revolution in a broad way, not just that march. And so we can really look at the details of the combined cooperation. And as I said, also the stories of these individuals, but what's also interesting is the French-American relations that are developing through this march and through this cooperation. Of course, it's not only military, it's also commercial, cultural, scientific, and political, which is what I write about in my book. Of course, I won't talk about all that right now. And so what's also very important to realize, again, it's really the most decisive operation of the American Revolution. It's considered the miracle year because despite all the problems that the Continental Army faced, they still won. And so it's sort of a question is, how was this almost impossible mission a success? And one of the reasons is this logistical organization of a few individuals that were part of this large operation. And so today what you can see is, you can see that's very relative. Some of the places are still to be really seen, as if you can see a field and then you can imagine a campsite on it. Some other places have now been constructed. So you'll see more like a commercial zone with development and with, for instance, a large supermarket placed on it, for instance, grocery stores or parking lots and so on. So the actual trail also is quite disappeared, except in a few places where you can actually still see the trail. Mostly it's been constructed zones today, but still there's lots of historical buildings that have been preserved. And as I already also maybe said, but the trail and so the road that they took still sometimes is actually a road now. So it can be a highway, it can be a little road, it can be the main road of one of the towns. So you can reconstruct this and you can reimagine while being on it. And so some of the troops were also transported on land. That's of course not something I'm going to focus on today, but it's important to realize that not everyone was marching. Some of the units were transported by boats, or some parts were marching, some other parts they were transported by boats. And as we'll see, they also crossed rivers as close to yours. Okay, and so there's a map if you're interested in actually exploring this entire trail. So now we'll focus, as I already announced, on this more specific road to Yorktown on September 9th and 10th. And so about Chastellux, so that person that I've discovered through his archives in his castle, what he had done before, so his role was, of course, he was part of the march, he was part of the officers that was commanding all these troops. And so he was mainly ahead of the troops before, just to prepare everything in advance. And he was often with Rochambeau, often with Washington to do this. But what he had done the previous year is that he had been studying all the options possible. So in the winter of 1780, when the French troops were still in Newport, he was on a sort of a reconnaissance mission throughout the United States, just to find out what can we do, which roads exist. They had to map the entire, all the different states, because the maps were not that great at the time yet. So the French engineers were sent on expeditions to really write the maps, to discover the roads, to see this could be a good camping site. So they have, Chastellux has lists and lists of just geographical details. All the different roads are mapped out, the different places they could camp, the places the officers could sleep in, the taverns, and so on. And he also, more specifically, just kind of tested out the whole route to go to Yorktown, because he was sent also to some missions, the Chesapeake Bay, in the spring of 1781. So we can see that this operation is not just sort of an improvised march, because sometimes it's presented that way, because it was decided upon in mid-August and they just left immediately. So it seems like they didn't really have time to prepare, but the French had a lot of months to prepare this in the previous winter, which is an overlooked moment in the American Revolution. But the French were actively preparing with some of their American colleagues that were actually explaining the terrain or the strategies with them. So that's more the Chastellux side. But again, I wanted to find things that he would have said about Harford County, but he just really doesn't mention it. But luckily, a lot of others do. And we'll see that it's especially about how complicated this specific route was through Harford County. So the French troops marched towards Baltimore. So you have to, again, imagine they come from New York, they go down, and at one point they have to cross Maryland in order to go to Baltimore, where a few ships were waiting for some of the transportations and where some other troops had to go further down south. And so on September 9th, they crossed this is for me complicated to pronounce, Susquehanna River. And so they what you call bivouacked. So they didn't really encamp, because they just didn't have their tents, as we'll see later, because they didn't arrive yet. But so they stayed at what's today Havre de Grace. And then the day after, they walked down to what was at the time called Bushtown, which is sort of at the head of Bush River, and at the south side of another river. So there's this is just it. They walked through Harford County, but they describe it quite a lot, as we'll see. And so the march was done, as I already mentioned, in separate columns and waves. So a wave, which I mean with that, is that when one of the regiments left, they would go for one day, but the other regiment would stay behind. And then the day after, the new regiment would come in, and then the other one would go away again. Because of course the encampments were not that large, and you couldn't have 9,000 people together in one camp. So they had these kind of waves in which from one day to the other, they would kind of, they would come in, and then later, and then that was the organization. And also some of the different units were divided. So that's why the testimonies I'm going to present are on different places while they're in the same march. Okay. So one of the most important historians that has done extensive research on this route is called Dr. Robert Seelig. And so he's been studying this extensively. So I'm basing a part of this specifically on the locations that have been identified by him on this route. And so we'll start with someone called, so I'm just using French testimonies to recreate this specific moment in time where they were in Harford County. So Flor, who is from German descent, was serving in the French army. He is describing the entire sort of route that they're taking through this. So on the 9th, we broke camp, meaning they broke camp, what's called a part of the head of elk. So they would go down. And so then 15 miles to Harford, or New Harford, a little town. The same day we encountered along the way a little town by the name of New Karlstad. Then, so the 10th, we broke camp again, and then they went to a place called, for him, Barge Tavern, but it's more Bush Tavern, a tavern along the road. Then they would send up camp close to it too. And then they would go further south, leaving Harford County, go to a place called Captain Philip, because that's just the name of the person that owned it, a pretty area. And then, of course, they went to Baltimore, which for him was a German city of respectable size, very much determined by trade because of its convenient harbor. So this kind of description is what you can find often. They don't really go into a lot of detail, but by putting them all together, we can reconstruct this moment in time where they really passed through Harford County. So just to go through a few of the details to make sure we understand what we're talking about, on September 9th, about 4,000 Frenchmen and about 1,000 Americans were beginning this march to Baltimore. So this is one of these units. Again, the larger army was about 9,000 men, but so here we have this group of about 5,000 together. So for just to imagine, this is a huge group of people that has to walk together, to be fed every day, to sleep every day. And as you can imagine, that's complicated. On some parts of their march, things were less complicated, but we'll see that specifically here, to cross the Susquehanna River was one of the most complicated parts with all these people. And they were not only people, they also had their horses, they had other animals for food, they had their large sort of buffalo, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but anyway, these large cows to pull their wagon train. And the wagon train means they had all their tents, their equipment, everything with them as well. So this is, again, a large operation to do. And so the French left on the 9th of September to go and cross into Harford County. And the New York regiments, because that's the Americans they were with, were leaving the day after that. And so the French infantry crossed the Susquehanna River on September 9th. And so that's the infantry, but then some other parts, so the artillery and wagons and what's called the Lausanne cavalry had to cross at another point because they couldn't cross where the others were crossing, leading to a separation and to quite some problems, as we'll see through the testimonies. And so then the part of that infantry, they slept at what's today Havre de Grace. Then September 10th, Lower Ferry, so Lower Ferry being Havre de Grace, they walked to a bush town where then they bivouacked again. Then they walked away and at the end of it all arrived in Baltimore. And so the French insights I'm gonna treat today are giving you some testimonies, of course, of these French participants. And what's interesting is that, of course, they're participating, cooperating, negotiating, but they also observe the young republic, as they would call it, or the nascent United States. They observe, in the case of Harford, mainly the nature, because they're impressed by the beauty of the nature and of the river specifically. And so they actually discuss a large variety of topics in all their testimonies, making them this eyewitness of what I already said, this sort of more broad story of the French-American cooperation, which goes far beyond military details. And so some of these French, of course, are Rochambeau himself, Chastellux, the one that I've been studying, but then there's a lot of other different sort of lower ranking officers that are commenting almost every day of their march. So this is a great source material, of course, to reconstruct the march, but also to understand what the French were thinking while on their march and what they were doing and how they organized themselves, especially, of course, to understand all that. Some other French, of course, just to make sure we don't forget, Lafayette and, for instance, Duportail were the French officers that were serving directly in the Continental Army. So they also left their testimonies, but it's specifically the French we're looking at now because they were moving down south while the others were already in Yorktown. So the one that I just mentioned, Mathieu Dumas. So Mathieu Dumas wrote, this is so he published way later in 1830s about this American campaign, but during his campaign, he was having sort of a draft version of a journal that he kept with him. It's a very small book, and that has been discovered not long ago somewhere in France. And so it really tells you the preparation of a march like this. And most often these testimonies have been lost because it's a draft of what he published later. So probably some people have a tendency of throwing these away, or they're not considered important at the time. But of course, for a historian, these are very important because they give you a sort of a rough image. They're not written for publication. They're not written to impress. They're just written to tell every day what's going on. And so he's explaining, before the rest of all the troops arrive in Harford County, he says, I left this night with workers to repair the roads on which the right column will pass. I was late and the night fell in and I had to stay in a barn. Well, that's a sort of standard thing, but it's actually quite interesting because most of the time everything goes wrong. Everything he has to do, night falls in way too early. It's getting super dark. He doesn't know where to go next. So he has to stay in everywhere he can stay. He doesn't really sleep often. It's a hard campaign for people like him that have to prepare everything in advance. So then after that uncomfortable night in that barn, he set out at the crack of dawn and arrived early in Octorara, which is one of these rivers where some of them were also pass. And I almost have traveled through the woods always. So this at that time, Harford County was very like lots of forest still, very dense forest. This part is little inhabited and the ground is sandy, clayey, and of bad quality. But the rural and almost wild parts are still pleasant by their variety. So these are interesting observations because while they're preparing a march, they're always looking around and thinking, where am I now? What's going on? And so for him, nature is very impressive here. Even if the ground is of bad quality for what he's thinking about agriculture in these cases, when he's describing land as bad, but he's also describing, as you can see here, the wild parts as being varied and beautiful. So what he's doing, I'm not going to go through all these quotes because that's too much, because Dumas wrote quite a lot about this, but he's dividing different groups. He's thinking of, okay, who can cross where, and he's preparing this together with the quarter master general, he's called Béville, and an American called Wadsworth, who is more in charge of the whole logistical side of the Americans and for provisions of the entire operation. So together with three of these men, they're really preparing in great detail where they have to walk, what the quarters will be per regiment, the different encampment sites are marked. And so this is interesting to see how much of a preparation was needed in order to just walk with about 5,000 men through Harford County, of course. And so he also has local guides to each group and stayed at the ferry to see the first carts pass. So these local guides are also interesting because the local population was helping. Not everywhere, sometimes the local population was quite hostile, but in other places they were really helping the French and Americans. They knew the roads, they knew where you could cross the river, they knew all these different things. So the guides were also essential. And so the local population of, for instance, Harford County was also crucial in order to help all these soldiers to cross. And so here he is. So there's lots of explanations on what they're exactly doing with the logistical side, but he's also taking time to, you can see here, to write a light sketch of the charming picture of the ford and the falls of Susquehanna. It's almost always at the edge of the rivers that one finds these extraordinary points of views. So he's standing somewhere where you can see the entire river and its valley and everything. And so he's saying that it's fordable everywhere, so you can pass. Of course, important for him, but there's also falls and cascades that have a beautiful effect in all the width of the river. And then there's lots of mountains covered with woods around it. And then he has an interesting observation saying that one sees some dwellings on the shore and one finds a trace of the man and the effects of his destructive hand. Interesting maybe for today as well, but so he was already seeing the effects of those that are cutting down all the trees and yeah, as you already mentioned before, of the variation of different plants and animals and everything before men came, let's say, and then afterwards destruction starts. It's quite interesting because he is an engineer just doing his job for the military, but he has quite a lot of these kind of observations throughout his route. So we have now, of course, understood Dumas had prepared the roads. Now they got the orders of where to cross. And now you can see a lot of other Frenchmen, such as Clermont de Crèvecoeur of September 9th, saying, we found the roads very frightful and we arrived in camp extremely late. The country is abominable, cut up by deep ravines and many small rivers, which the soldiers were obliged to ford after removing their shoes and stockings. So this is a complicated river to cross, as we'll see as well. here with another French testimony, Amblard, that is writing the passage over the Susquehanna River took place with difficulty since it had not been foreseen. The army remained for almost 2 days without supplies and without tents and camping equipment. This is because these big wagons with all the tents could just not cross there. They needed to take a whole detour, so they couldn't, which leads them to their stay in Harford County to not have a tent, to just sleep in the open air in Havre de Grace, but also later in bush camp or the bush encampment. So here as well, he's Closen, this is the Baron von Closen, also in his travel diary describes September 9th, that here's the road for Baltimore, obliged army to cross the river at Lower Ferry. There was only one boat, and so the others had to go higher up. As I already said, the wagons and all these like larger things had to be transported by boat, but there were no boats, and so they had to walk much further and take a whole detour. And so they are staying now at a place called, at the time, Orlavara Creek, and maybe now Octoraro Creek. And so there they could stay. So we are now looking at two divided columns that are trying to pass this river with great difficulties. And so Dupont, also one of the French officers, is also describing this moment when the trains were separated from the columns, and so it was all very hard to do that. And so the bad road, which we'll meet with, will deprive us for several days of them and make an exchange of our beds for simple bear skins. So just sort of to imagine the hardships of these moments where people could not actually sleep normally in tent. They had to just sleep on bear skins, or actually on nothing at all, of course, because this is an officer who could afford maybe to trade that or to do that. But most soldiers were just really sleeping in the open air with all their equipment in probably a very hot climate with lots of mosquitoes and everything. So it's not an easy march, obviously. And so after all this terrible crossing, and then of course they arrive, they can walk further down to what's today Havre de Grace. And on this specific place, the intersection of Maryland 7 and Old Bay Lane, there is the bivouac site. So this is where they could just stay. And if you're familiar with this road, it's maybe quite interesting to imagine that about 4,000 Frenchmen were just laying here for one night to go at the end to Yorktown. So the day after, again, the roads were virtually impassable, as Crèvecoeur is mentioning. And so he said again, so they were crossing later because he's part of that group. And so it was so rocky that the horses risked breaking their legs. All the way across, we were in water up to our waist and the horses up to their knees. And the wagons crossed with the greatest difficulties, and they actually lost several horses as well. Then, luckily, after this terrible moment, he's looking around and realizing it's very picturesque. When you approach the White River, we came down a very steep mountain that descended abruptly to its bank, leaving no room. So again, this is of course annoying if you're a military man, but it's in the same time very beautiful, of course, these like cliffs and very abrupt endings and like these large rivers. And then we saw only one house on the whole route, which is also interesting because it was not very densely populated at the time, of course. So after this, another complicated day of some still crossing the river, some others just marching from what's today Havre de Grace to this bush town encampment, of which you can see the location on the map. They arrived after this new 12 miles march, and so they set up for the night. And so it's not even called an encampment, it's called a bivouac, because of course it's not a real encampment, as they didn't have their material to make their encampments. So this starts to become almost comical, as in how hard it was to cross Harford County. But of course, again, they were observing how beautiful it was, while it was very complicated for this kind of operation to cross. Then Dumas, of course, responsible for this entire operation, he was saying the officers had all arrived without the slightest accident. Even if it was hard, nothing bad happened, but they believed or said that they had arrived by miracle after crossing this Susquehanna River. And then he said, I had a lot to answer and a lot to refute, and I only satisfied the reasonable people. So people were really mad at him, and I retired quite tired anyways. So he's a little frustrated here because he planned so well, he did everything he could, but unfortunately these wagons just couldn't come with him. So people had to sleep without their equipment, and of course were quite mad at that to Dumas. All right, so now we arrive at this. So Bushtown, some of the French observers, Coiré, is also there and is describing that it's consisting of a few houses gathered close to the small Bush River, which has basins to turn the mills. From the ferry, the country is more open and the soil appears fertile. One encounters numerous very new clearings. Agriculture is almost exclusively that of maize, which is corn today, or at least in French, maïs. And so it's just interesting because they're describing agriculture a lot, because some of the French are very interested in agriculture, and especially in this development of the new land that is America. And that's to come back to Chastellux. He is extremely interested in that and observing that actually the United States is going to be a very large agricultural producer that will definitely take over sort of the first position that the Europeans had for their export of products, meaning that there would be a whole new market for Europe, which was good, but it would also be a very serious competitor in the future is what he can predict. And so most of these French officers are actually interested in agriculture because of what it could mean for the future of the United States, and what it could also mean for the future of France in the meantime. And so here he's also describing the same point of it's extremely wooded, but cut up by several streams with run factories. The most considerable one is the Fort of Nottingham in one of the branches of the Gunpowder River. And so it's very rich, and to judge from the look, should be abundant. So there could be, so some of them were commenting on the soil being bad, but here apparently it's getting better. And so that's a good sign for most of these people. So here you can see where they stayed exactly on one of the maps of Berthier, who is the French map maker, totally turned in order to see how it looked. This is made by Robert Seelig, who is describing exactly where they were staying. So you can see that road going to Lower Ferry here. And so they were staying on these different, this is the encamp or bivouac encampment where they were staying. So then after this, from Bushtown, they marched to White Marsh, where they would stay. And that's where they could finally get their tents and their belongings back, because the wagons finally arrived there as well. So after 2 days without being in a tent, they could sleep like this, which is actually maybe even worse, because in a tent, they were often sleeping with many men, about 6 to 9 per tent. This is only for, of course, the soldiers. But the officers and generals were, of course, sleeping in the taverns nearby or in private homes. But for the soldiers, I just wanted to emphasize how hard this march must have been. And so the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Trail can tell all these small stories, let's say, of the local stories that are to be told in order to understand this march. But also, if you combine all of them, you can understand what the march meant for those that participated. You can actually also imagine how it looked by looking at their testimonies, the different forests, different woods, different agricultural sites that have been described are all quite, of course, relevant for us for understanding this last phase of the American Revolution, and to understand, of course, the individual experiences of them through this route. And so, of course, Harford County was one of the stops of this march that led to victory. And it could have gone obviously quite wrong if ever all these wagons could never have crossed the river. So by making all these efforts, by sacrificing horses, by having everyone suffering quite a lot, they still made it happen and could advance quickly enough in order to go down again quickly enough to beat the British at the end of their road. So that's the relevance of Harford County for this march to Yorktown. And all these stories really matter for making the American War of Independence a success.
Well, thank you. It's very interesting to learn what Harford County looked like 250 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Harford County at that point, because the county was actually organized in 1773 and 1774. So by 1781, we were a functioning independent county separate from Baltimore County. So in terms of setting the timing up related to other pieces of the county's history, that was very interesting. thinking about all the sites that are along this march within Harford County,
Yeah.
you given any thought to how folks in Harford County might be able to participate in America 250, which is coming up in a couple of years, so that we can highlight these sites in the county?
Yes, because there are a few, I should look up the names again, but there are a few homes that are still standing that were standing at the time. And there's, for instance, the site of the encampment, there is a home that was not necessarily totally there, but the structure was there or something like that. So you could recreate where they exactly, what the French or the American troops walking by could have actually seen. And I would say that crossing site of the Susquehanna River could be an actual place where you could do reenactments of that crossing, or maybe not with all the horses, it must be very terrible to organize, but at least with a few ferry boats or something like that, or to have that point, because that's an important crossing for this whole expedition. So maybe you can focus on that one. And then in general, Maryland, of course, as a state could, you could make it a little larger by incorporating the other sites that were in Maryland. Of course, it was a short, like they walked by or in Maryland, relatively short compared to some other states. So there are less stories to tell maybe than others, but if you combine them all, you can have a real point to make, as in Maryland was one of the states that they crossed. And so some of the, well, you can tell the local population stories if you can find some of them. You can tell the stories of this, what I just said about all these French testimonies and descriptions of the places they go through, to also sometimes imagine that 250 years ago, the country was so different that a lot of places were still sort of the wild land, as called by the French, the wild forest, the places that are not under agriculture or not even inhabited yet. And so I would say these kind of stories are interesting to tell. And then the stories, again, of the local population that were helping them out. These are what you can call today sort of this forgotten heroes of the American Revolution, but by these local people that were living in the area that showed them, no, don't go there in the river, that's dangerous signs, for instance. These things are, of course, crucial for on the larger scale winning this war. So these kind of stories have to be told, and you can do some events telling that, or joining with some other states around to just tell these stories, but especially make those that are living around there today aware of it. Because that's what I felt quite often when you go to places around this route, is that people don't really realize what happened almost in their own backyards. And I think that makes history come alive much more. It makes it something relevant for everyone that is living around, because you realize, hey, my county or my town or my garden played actually a role in the American Revolution. So by making that connection, and also by telling the more diverse stories, as I said at the beginning, way more groups were participating than are often acknowledged. And so that is also something to be able to tell through local stories, through the sort of individual stories of those people.
I noticed in the writings, they very clearly, the Army bivouacked at Bush, and the tavern at Bush is still standing.
Yes.
And in fact, our next brown bag lunch will be a discussion of the archaeology that's been done by the State Highway Administration at the Bush Tavern, because also the Bush Declaration, which was one of the very early declarations of independence, it precedes the one that was signed in Philadelphia, was signed there at the Bush Tavern, and we call it the Bush Declaration for obvious reasons.
Yeah, interesting. There's also this Cummings Tavern that at least has a sign, so I'm sure there's something. That's also a building.
Right, but this one is further north, because looking at the sign, it's where they cross at Bald Friar, which is much further north in the county and along the Susquehanna, because apparently there was a better ford there. Of course, that whole ford now is underwater because the Conewango Dam dams the Susquehanna up in that part of the county now. But it's interesting to see, and I had heard that the French, or that the Army had marched in the area of Darlington, and now I understand why. because they had to cross there at Bald Friar and then come back to, and they came back down to Bush, it sounds like, from the way you describe, from the way that
Yes,
the notices there, or they bet some, I guess some of them reunited at White Marsh.
exactly. At the end, they came kind of together in White Marsh.
In White Marsh,
with these wagons, with the tents that were quite needed. So yeah.
So I'll have to go and look along Route 7.
Yes.
Because you mentioned the fact that there are places where the road, the trail is still intact, and much of that is Route 7, which is the old Philadelphia road.
Yeah, so that would be exactly they will follow, because of course roads have naturally evolved, and so most of these roads are still roads for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, much of White Marsh is now taken up with a great big mall. But I'll look along Route 7.
I've actually been there because I was wondering, hey, can we find something? And there was really not much besides many restaurants.
Many restaurants in White Marsh. But Route 7 is just south of the mall. So the area in there. You are Dutch.
Yeah.
How did you come to be interested in the American Revolution and so much in the French role in the Revolution?
Yes.
It seems a long way from
exactly.
the Netherlands.
And also the Dutch played their own role. So it would have been maybe more logical that I would have studied that, because of course they financed quite a bit of the American revolutionary effort. But I am of course Dutch, but I moved with my parents when I was 5 years old to France. And so this is going to be a personal fun story that I've already told you, of course. But so it's when I went to France when I was 5 years old, we had this garden, and in the garden there was a tree called the tulip poplar tree. And the tulip poplar tree, according to the legend of those living around us, said that it was planted by Lafayette around 250 years ago. Well, at that time, more like 230 years ago. And so I was, when I grew up, I've always thought like, okay, we have this Lafayette tree, whatever that means. And you had to stand around it with 6 people because it's so large. And people were explaining that it was not a natural tree. It had to come from America. So it kind of made sense. It was a true story. But when I was around 18 years old, for just a history project at school, I wanted to find out if that was true. And so I went to an archive in Dijon, and in Dijon, it became clear that it was not Lafayette himself, but that it was actually someone else called Chastellux, the uncle of Lafayette. Uncle by marriage, by the way, because so he's the uncle of Adrienne de Noailles, Lafayette's wife. And so that led me to just realizing there was a village close by to our own home called Chastellux. And so I thought, how funny, that's the same name, without knowing anything else. But so I went to that village, Chastellux, and I saw that there was a huge castle, the Chastellux castle. And I found out that you could still visit it, and that the owner of the castle gave the tours. And so his name was Philippe. So I contacted him and visited him, and I explained that we had that tree planted probably by his ancestor. And when he heard that, he said that that was so interesting because they had the same tree in the garden of their chateau. And so this is how it all started, that at the end of a few years of more research and reading about Francois Jean de Chastellux. So Francois Jean de Chastellux is a major general fighting under Rochambeau who went to America between 1780 and 83. And he wrote quite a famous travel diary on that called The Travels of Chastellux Through America. And so in that, he is describing almost everything besides, unfortunately, Harford County, but he's describing everything he's seeing on his different travels to explore America. But the thing is, he doesn't describe the march to Yorktown in his travel diary, because he's describing the travels he did prior and after that. It's quite the mistake he made, because that's why he's not known, because he didn't talk about the most important campaign, nor about the Battle of Yorktown, which is not a good PR thing to do. But in his private papers, you can reconstruct everything he's done in the years during the American Revolution. And so anyway, that travel diary led me to go back to the Chateau de Chastellux, because I wanted to know more, and I wanted to talk again to Philippe, and especially to understand why there was not much source material, so historical documents on Chastellux to be found anywhere else. So when I went back, he said, well, we have a tower full of archives of my family, but it starts in 1328 and goes up until today. So the thing is, it's so large. I'm not sure what we have because it's sort of overwhelming to have 700 years of family history all in one tower. And so after a little while, we could find actually Francois Jean Chastellux' box. And in the box, we found letters of Washington, of Jefferson, of Franklin, of Adams, of Rochambeau, of Lafayette, all these people, but also a large collection of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, such as Voltaire and Diderot and D'Alembert, but also David Hume and Jeremy Bentham, and some Italian opera writers, and so on. So what you can see is a huge collection of this man that was not only a military man, but also himself a philosopher of the Enlightenment. And so he, as a person, really embodies the French-American relations of the time, because he was involved not only in the military side, but also more the political, the intellectual, the scientific side of it all. So during the American Revolution, that really comes out, and especially in his papers. So finding all that led me to become very interested in all this and led me to write my PhD and my book now. And the book I'm writing now is, I started writing a biography on Chastellux, which is done and published in France. And I wanted to kind of do the same in English, but shorter. But while writing, I realized I wanted to do it about a group of people he was working with. So those that I quoted today are part of the group, of course, but it's focusing on several Frenchmen, not only on one, because only focusing on one individual, of course, is very interesting. You can learn a lot from it, but looking more at the group, I can really say something more about the French expedition in the American Revolution. So long answer to a short question,
but I really appreciate you sharing that story, because I think it speaks to how people become interested in history. And you started with an interest in a very local piece of history. How did this tulip poplar tree come to be here?
Yes.
And so by learning a little bit about local history, it sort of led you out into international history.
Exactly. And now going back to very local history, if you think about this route and different places, sites, homes that are still around it, that's again local. And I still focus on individuals because I like that micro approach. So,
well, thank you very, very much. When will your book be coming out? Do you have
the English book I'm writing right now? So it's going to take about a year. So, but when that's done, I will definitely inform you.
Yes,
it will be
please.
published by the University of Virginia Press. So I'm working hard and I would love it to be done sooner rather than later, I have to say. But it's a lot of work always, and the more you dig into all these French sources, the more you find. So it's terrible, actually. It's a long process.
It's never finished. They just come and take it away.
Exactly.
So let us know when you finish, when your book is out, because I know that the Historical Society would be delighted to have you come and visit us in person.
Yes.
And maybe we can do a book signing and you can talk a little bit more about everything you've learned.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really do want to also thank everybody who's been with us during this discussion. And let me get the other slide up so that I can. Let's see here. Here we go. I do want to thank you. And we thank you so much, Iris, for doing this. This has really been fascinating to learn. If you'd like to learn a little bit more from Iris, you can check out an article that she's written, Retracing Our Steps. It's on the website of the American Battlefield Trust, which you can find at battlefields.org. If you've enjoyed this event, please consider making a donation or becoming a member of the Historical Society of Harford County. You can visit our website, www.harfordhistory.org, and you'll find a complete listing of our upcoming events, a calendar that's busier than it's been for a very long time. We're so glad that we're able to go back to doing in-person events as well as adding virtual to our repertoire. On October the 8th, there will be an uncomfortable conversation about the civil rights in Harford County, and it's going to be presented by Dr. James Carmel of the Community College at 2 p.m. This will be a live in-person event at the Historical Society of Harford County at our headquarters building, 143 North Main Street in Bel Air. The cost for that was $10. On October the 15th, we'll have the annual genealogy conference. And again, it will be in person. It will also be at the Historical Society. It will run from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. and the cost of that is $20. Sorry. And finally, plan to visit us on Saturday, October the 22nd at our annual yard sale and volunteer open house. That will be open from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Also at headquarters, 143 North Main Street in Bel Air. It's the corner of Main and Gordon Streets. If you're familiar with the area, you can visit us and learn more what our volunteers do and how you might be able to become a volunteer at the Historical Society. And if you're interested, you could also have a table at the yard sale. Again, you register online for that at www.harfordhistory.org. On the website, you'll also find a list of all of our other upcoming events, more about the history of Harford County, and instructions for joining the society. The web address again is www.harfordhistory.org. Thank you very much for joining us today.